Whistling 5 Anarchic Productions proudly presents Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s stories, as told by Andrew Brammer. Hello and welcome. The story you are about to hear is written and told using its original source materials, scribblings and scratchings from the scrawls of Stumpy, found within Stumpy Sanderson's time capsule, which was buried in 1979 and then unearthed in 2019. The story is told in the first person, as I, just like Stumpy, witnessed at first hand the momentous events which it recounts. So let's park up our rally choppers and tomahawks and take a ride back to 1976 for HMS Puffer. Trafalgar, Jutland, Midway. Of all the great naval battles in history, probably the least documented is the Battle of Wardown Park Lake, which took place on a hot, early afternoon in June 1976. The following account is the only official record that remains of that infamous day. Despite all the premonitions of disaster, we were as stunned as anyone to learn that in our final weeks of middle school, our art class was going to be treated to a field trip to the picturesque setting of Wardown Park, deep across the border in the bandit territory of Luton. Despite the grave misgivings from the headmaster, Mr. Jensen, this trip had been organised by a couple of good and liberal teaching eggs, Mr. Naseby and Miss Harrison, who felt it would provide an ideal final opportunity for us to put into practice some of what they had been trying to teach us about French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting, whatever they were. The one condition, though, that Jensen had insisted upon before approving this trip, taking into account all previous school trips, which had proved, in his words, recipes for chaos, mayhem, and outright hooliganism, was that Mr. Kemp, that sadistic deputy head with a Hitler moustache and coal scuttle haircut, would accompany us. Kemp had laid down his marker for this trip by frisking us all before we boarded the sky blue Bedford VAL coach, and duly confiscating our cigarettes and our spud guns. Now, Wardown Park was a large scenic park, situated on the flowing River Lee, and within which were not only several landscaped formal gardens, sporting grounds, and a small museum, but also a large boating lake, which was formed by the widening river, and within which stood a small island that was strictly out of bounds for any members of the public. This lake was home to a large collection of waterfowl, including various species of geese, swans, and ducks. The events of the actual morning and lunchtime were largely boring and uneventful, as we all split into groups, each with the task of trying to draw or watercolour our chosen scene within the sizzling heat of the park. A few members of the class actually put in some worthwhile efforts, but our gang's drawings were more primitive affairs, mainly resembling Neolithic artwork. However, Puffer Patterson, that great thespian and key member of our gang, had fully got into character by adopting the persona of a cross between Toulouse-Lautrec and Claude Monet, expertly setting his picture up on an easel in front of a willow tree-lined section of the lake, flamboyantly painting with his watercolour brush in one hand, smoking in the other a Gitane's cigarette which he had ingeniously concealed within his art materials, and speaking with an affected French accent every time he made a colourful pastel brushstroke. Quelle couleur! C'est magnifique! But it was after we had finished our packed lunches of pork luncheon meat sandwiches, Golden Wonder crisps, and bottles of Cresta, and after we had been allowed to leave our art folders and materials back on the coach, that the day was to take its historic turn, when Mr. Naseby and Miss Harrison, obviously without the approval of Mr. Kemp, who had mysteriously developed a headache with all the heat of the sun and was taking a nap in the school coach, fatally gave us permission for an hour and a half of free time to explore and enjoy the park at our leisure. Never in the history of middle school field trips has so much resulted from such a simple granting of freedom. So now there we were. Me, Stumpy Sanderson, Puffer Patterson, Bendy Henderson, Smiler Morton, and Gorper Alsop, all waiting to take our places in the two-person pedalos into which the boatman was guiding those of us who had chosen to go boating on the lake. Just ahead of us, and taking their seats in their pedalo, were our most notorious and long-standing foes. Those suede-headed, razor-lipped twins of terror, wearing 18-hole cherry-red Doc Martin boots. Mandy and Melanie Milton. But of course, we all had a mischievous ulterior motive for our trip out onto the lake. For having been stripped earlier of our spud guns, us and the Milton sisters were instead armed to the teeth with bags of bread that were meant to be for feeding the ducks, and which we had all been allowed to buy just after lunch with the spending money we had been permitted to bring on the trip. Another of the innocent and unwitting Mr. Naseby's and Miss Harrison's fatal mistakes of that day. For, whilst a few of the art class had indeed used their purchase for its correct use of fowl feeding, us and the Milton sisters had all realised that these bags of bread would make for very useful weaponry in the absence of our spud guns. As we all began taking our seats, the serious-faced boatman said in a sombre tone, "You can go anywhere within the designated boating area, and you can feed the ducks. But stay away from the island over there. That's strictly out of bounds." Our curiosity about the small island was further piqued when, just as we started getting aboard our pedalos, a wizened old crone with a tobacco-ravaged face toddled past us and cackled, "No, you don't want to head out to that island, for if you do, old King Henry and his boys will get you." We had no idea from where this old crone had appeared, and just as soon as she had spoken, she disappeared to where we knew not. Now, of course, our ears had immediately pricked up at all this, because to boys like us, any instruction or warning, such as out of bounds, had exactly the same moth-to-flame-like attraction as signs or instructions which stated, "Keep out," "Do not touch," "Wet paint," or best of all, "Danger of death." And these restrictions acted like a magnet to draw us to do the very opposite, particularly as we didn't know exactly why the island was out of bounds, and particularly as we had now heard the tantalising and mysterious mention of old King Henry and his boys. Who were they? Some Luton gang of cutthroats? And it was clear the Milton sisters also shared the same daring and mischievous intentions as us, and we could immediately see, from the looks on their razored features, that their plan was to set sail immediately for that island and to beat us there, especially when they threw down the challenge that the first ones to the island would win a week's worth of cresta from the others. A challenge answered with an instant done by Stumpy. And the challenge was on. With this, and without a moment's warning, the Milton sisters were off, pedalling furiously and gaining an immediate head start on the Green Lake, water spuming and splashing up in their wake, and putting clear distance between us as we were still taking our positions in our pedalos. But despite this clear head start, we neither panicked nor worried. Why were we so calm? It was because, being the greatest thespian of his generation, Puffer Patterson had now once again magically got into character. As Stumpy and I got ready in our pedalo for his orders, Gorper and Smiler in theirs, Puffer, with great nautical dignity, was piped aboard his and Bendy's vessel, Bendy whistling his best and closest rendition of a boatswain's whistle. Saluting us and the baffled boatman, Puffer calmly issued orders to "Away anchors!" And when we had guided our small flotilla out onto the open waters and were ready, he gave the command for the pursuit. Puffer was magnificent. Marshalling our pedalling into a disciplined rhythm of seamanship, he was transformed into our Captain Ahab, our Quint, our Admiral of the fleet, shouting and issuing naval commands and orders, urging us on, at various points rising from his seat, leaving the pedalling to the long-legged and reedy frame of Bendy, whose long legs could accomplish in one turn what us smaller characters could only achieve in two. Puffer motivated us like a true commander, and, as we steadily gained on the lesser disciplined pedalling of the Milton sisters, he used a rolled-up core comic as a telescope as he called out to us, "Come on, my boys, pedal straight and true. We're gaining, boys, we're gaining, and by Nelson's column, when we get within range, we shall give those Milton sisters a broadside of bread that will lower their Jolly Rogers." And indeed, we were gaining, our disciplined and furious pedalling running down the splashing and thrashing of the much larger than us Milton sisters. The battle itself was eventually fought some 25 yards from the island. The Milton sisters, realizing that they were being run down and that we would soon catch them, knew they would have to fight. As a result, they slowed up their pedalling and swung their boat to face our flotilla of 3. Puffer now became our admirals Collingwood, Jellicoe, and Nimitz, all rolled into one. Standing up from his seat again, he shouted his commands for me and Stumpy to attack one flank, Smiler and Gorper another, whilst he and Bendy would steam headlong into the pair. As we all pedalled slower, encircling the Milton sisters' pedalo, we armed ourselves with handfuls of bread, all of us running these into and through the water, so that each handful would represent a soggy and doughy mess, the Milton sisters doing the same. We got within 5 yards of our targets, and then the firing commenced. Never in the history of naval battles has so much soggy bread been hurled in such a short space of time. Within no time at all, we had scored numerous hits on the Milton sisters, showering them with wet dough. One phenomenal shot from Smiler, his trademark never-ending smile on his face, actually caught Mandy Milton full on her Roman nose, leading to a shriek of outrage and dire warnings of the fate that would befall us once they got their hands on us. But we were simply too quick, too cunning, and too numerous for them, and our pedalling and rotating pedalo techniques so proficient that we were easily able to dodge, duck, and dive to miss all their bred missiles. We actually hadn't taken any direct hits at all, their shots either flying wildly over our heads or simply hitting with a soggy thud the side of our boats. But, unbeknown to us at the time, the battle was about to turn on two key and unfortunate events. Firstly, the amount of bread now in the water meant that numerous flocks of ducks and swans were heading to the scene of the battle, their quacking, squawking, and hissing filling the air. As the fowl now congregated amongst us, pecking at and lifting the bread from the water, this significantly affected our turning manoeuvres and our ability to spin around in our pedalos, in turn giving the Milton sisters invaluable time and opportunity. Secondly, Puffer, now becoming too animated in his role, had moved right to the edge of the prow of his and Bendy's pedalo, his plump and portly figure proudly standing right on the edge of the boat, rolled up core comic raised in his hand like some corsair's cutlass as he urged, "Let's finish them, lads! One more effort!" And it was at this very moment that Mandy Milton pulled from her depleted bag of duck feed a large and oversized, misshapen half-cob of bread, aimed carefully, and hurled it, hitting Puffer full on the forehead. For a few agonizing moments, Puffer swayed and staggered around like a spinning top on the pedalo's deck, like some punch-drunk Jack Tar, before keeling over, and then, with a huge splash, he toppled overboard, landing on his back in the warm green water, us looking on horrified, the Milton sisters roaring with laughter, squawking waterfowl all around him. Just at that moment, Stumpy shouted, "Look, it's Kemp!" And amidst all the pandemonium and mayhem, we saw, rowing towards us, now recovered from his headache, and having woken from his sleep in the coach, and having seen from the bank what we were up to, Mr. Kemp in a hired rowing boat, rowing furiously. Even at that range, we could see his face was seething. Now, because these were the days long before health and safety, none of us were wearing life jackets, even though only a couple amongst us could swim. Luckily, though, Puffer was one of those who could. And, because of his portly size, he was also a buoyant boy. And bobbing like a cork, he was able to easily propel himself in the water. He also now saw his chance for glory, and the prized bounty of Cresta that was the wager for the first to reach the island. And beautifully switching into new character modes, he now became an astonishing cross between Captain Bligh and Robinson Crusoe. "The island, boys! I'll head for the island! And by Bluebeard's treasure chest, I will win the bounty of Cresta from those varmints that put me in this water." And at great speed he cast off, laying on his back and propelling through the water like some podgy torpedo, warm water slipstreaming in his wake. Puffer reached the little tree and undergrowth-filled island's shore just as Kemp was nearly on us, and as we let out a great cheer, the Milton sisters looked on with bitter envy. As Puffer now stood, turned, and waded in the willow-touched shallows, he turned again to face us, gave a huge smile, a salute, and a double-armed wave, and then, like a gear, took his first steps onto the small island, disappearing into the undergrowth. But it was then that we heard it. An awful shriek, and suddenly we saw Puffer race out of that undergrowth, a terrified look on his face, running as fast through the shallows as his small rotund figure would let him, dive straight back into the water in his sodden clothes, and, with his round face just above the surface, begin swimming like a manic jet-propelled and rotund water boatman. Just behind him, we saw the reason for his terror. 5 huge, grey-brown-backed Canadian geese, with their black necks and heads and white cheek patches, and at their head, the most ferocious-looking bird we had ever seen, spitting and hissing, flapping enormous wings that looked as large as a pterodactyl's. And with horror, we all realised what the old crone's words of warning were about. For Puffer had now met old King Henry and his boys. As Puffer swam desperately towards us, and we sat helplessly in our now stationary and bobbing pedalos, Mr. Kemp upon us and roaring, "Patterson, get out of that water immediately, lad!" We saw old King Henry and his very angry boys had taken to the water, hissing and honking, and were steaming at full pelt towards Puffer, all of us, and the bread-filled water. And we all realised that on numerous fronts, our goose was now going to be well and truly cooked. Thank you for listening to this episode of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories. And don't forget to listen out for Stumpy and Gang's next adventure. For further information on all things Stumpy Sanderson, please visit www.stumpysanderson.co.uk. And you can also check out the Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories YouTube channel. But before we saddle up again on our rally choppers and tomahawks, let's take a listen to the strange little song that was specially written by Stumpy to accompany this podcast's tale. This song is performed for us now by Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s acoustic archive. Let's rock!
Steamship sailing, sail away. Steamship sailing, far away. Sail away across the ocean, that is Wardown Lake. But don't ever forget us and come back one day. Steamship sailing, sail away. Steamship sailing, far away. Sail away on your adventures, great deeds of daring do. But don't ever forget us, whatever you do. Little steamship, steamship, don't forget us as you sail into clear waters. Steamship, don't forget us as you sail off into the sun, into the sun.